Hello everyone, David Adler here, President of IHRA, and you can see sitting next to me someone who needs no introduction to the Jewish community, former ambassador to Israel and now member for Wentworth, which has the largest Jewish community in Sydney. Dave Sharma, thank you so much for your time.
Good morning, David. Nice to join you.
Now, I want to talk to you quickly about a couple of issues of concern to the Jewish community. Unfortunately, there's been a rise in anti-Semitism. Internationally, Australia is not exempt. And we had a very encouraging statement from the Prime Minister late last year saying that Australia would adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. I understand that has your support.
Very much. I was an advocate for it. I have been an advocate for it for many years.
It leaves the obvious question, what next? I mean, saying that the IHRA definition is going to be accepted in Australia, adopted by the government, is very important, has our strong support. We need to turn our minds to implementation. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Look, absolutely. I think, firstly, your initial point that anti-Semitism is on the rise is unfortunately true, and we see it now in Australia and around the world as no longer the preserve of the traditional far right, if you like, but also increasingly the people who would identify themselves as the progressive left, if you like, which means it's becoming more widespread, and I think it's becoming, in some ways, almost normalised in our political discourse, which is why I think the adoption of the IHRA definition is incredibly important, because what it does is it actually sets a standard and articulates a guideline for what does and does not constitute anti-Semitism in public discourse or commentary. I think the adoption of the definition is important, but what is very important now is to make sure that that definition is implemented in practice. And I think particularly the areas where we tend to see the most worrying signs of anti-Semitism in the public arena anyway are university campuses and broadcasting in the media. So I think making sure that these organisations, including universities, are aware of the definitions, and particularly any body that's publicly funded, ABC, SBS and our universities, take steps to actively implement the definition through their own code of conduct or internal policies. I think that's really the next challenge here.
Well, that's I'd agree 100%, and hopefully after the next election we'll have an opportunity to turn our minds to it and see what can be done. A specific example arose in Sydney, of course, which was the Sydney Festival.
Yes.
And the BDS campaign against the Sydney Festival. Now, you called that out quite vigorously. Can you reiterate what a couple of your comments were about that campaign?
Yeah, look, so you might recall that it came up quite early on. I think before the Sydney Festival had even commenced. This was in very early in January. And there are a number of artists who basically, and activists really, who called for a boycott of the Sydney Festival because there was an Israeli performance, or one that was choreographed by an Israeli choreographer, being performed by the Sydney Dance Company. Ohad Naharan, who's a very well-known choreographer from the Batsheva Dance Company in Tel Aviv. A number of artists called for the whole festival to be boycotted and for artists to withdraw from it because there was an Israeli choreographer being included in this, and because the Israeli embassy, as is completely normal all around the world, had contributed some public diplomacy money to allow Ohad Naharan to come out here. So I was very critical for a number of reasons. One, because only Israel was being singled out here, as is often the case. This is a sort of a textbook example of anti-Semitism. If the Russian Bolshoi Ballet was coming out, I don't think we would have had a call to boycott it because of what Putin had done, at least before Ukraine, or any number of other, the United States under Trump, no one said that we should boycott the United States, but they seem to suggest we should do this. But as well as that, I think it's a worrying stifling of what the art should be about, which is free speech and free expression. We shouldn't have people being deplatformed or cancelled just because they don't entirely sign up to our worldview. In fact, art is all about challenging people's worldview. So I was very critical of that for a number of reasons, not least of which is the one that it singled out Israel, as usual, for particular criticism, and made a number of unfounded allegations, as these activists always do about it. So I was glad that the festival stood up against those attempts to intimidate it. I don't think all the artists or performers did, unfortunately. And I worry that those who supported the boycott will be certainly at least considering doing it again in future. And that's the start of the BDS movement here in Australia.
You're absolutely right that I think that what's happened with the Sydney Festival is a win for the BDS advocates, and it will embolden them to try again and again on other activities. And that's why we want to draw attention to the potential of anti-BDS laws. As you're aware, they do exist in the majority of American states.
Yes.
In the United Kingdom, there have been small introductions so that public superannuation funds, councils, etc., are constrained from giving money. I want to make the point that anti-BDS laws are very narrow. The only thing that they constrain is public money.
Public money, yeah.
You can make any expression for or against Israel or whatever you like, it's not affected. Do you see that we could have a look at anti-BDS laws for Australia? There was an attempt a few years ago which didn't go anywhere, but in the light of recent experience.
I think it's certainly something worth examining. There would obviously be, there would be a state jurisdictional component to this and potentially a federal one as well, given our system of government. And I know a number of people, at least in New South Wales, have proposed this, and I think in Victoria from time to time. I think it's something that should be examined. I think it would be something that would be perfect for a parliamentary committee to inquire into, to hear evidence, to look at some of the examples from overseas jurisdictions, to see how it would operate in practice, and potentially to come up with some draft legislative framework like we've done with any number of other policy issues. So I think it's something that we should look to pursue in the next term of Parliament, ideally through a parliamentary committee of inquiry.
We're raising it at the moment at New South Wales level because of the Sydney Festival experience, and New South Wales is not about to go into an election, so we'll see how that's handled. Now, because we are going into an election, people do start to focus on the difference in policies between the major parties. And when it comes to Israel, there is a stark difference now, because at the last Labor National Conference, there was a resolution to put into the platform unconditionally recognition of a state of Palestine. Now, the coalition doesn't take that view.
No.
What's the coalition perspective in contrast to Labor?
Well, the coalition perspective is that we support a two-state solution, but one that can only come about through direct negotiation between the parties. So we don't believe in unilaterally seeking to change the facts on the ground, so to speak, and we certainly wouldn't be unilaterally seeking as an Australian government to preempt the outcome of negotiations directly between the two parties. Now, our view is we've always supported negotiations. We believe Israel has approached negotiations now going back, first to the UN partition plan or before, which has supported a two-state solution, but the other side has not been willing to make the compromise necessary to achieve that. So we'd like to see that come about. Labor's policy is different, and I'd make another point here as well, which I think is worth making. Firstly, in a scenario where Labor forms government, it's almost certainly going to be reliant upon the cooperation of the Greens, especially in the Senate, but potentially also in the House. And so the Greens will have a say over Labor policy here, and I think the Greens have a more extreme view towards Israel than most of mainstream Australia does. The other point I'd make is I think we have a different policy on BDS as well. I know the Labor Party has made a point of coming out to condemn BDS, but when the BDS movement reared its head most recently at the Sydney Festival, we heard nothing from them. It's very easy to condemn it in theory, but it's actually when you have to put some political skin in the game and perhaps upset some of your supporters, that's when that really matters.
The couple of powerful points. The point about the Greens is particularly powerful, and I'd point out that they are the only political party in the country which has rejected the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. So look, thank you, Dave, again for your time and for your comments on these issues. Is there anything further you want to add?
Look, I'd just say, obviously I've been a friend of Israel and the Jewish community going back now many years from when I was an ambassador. And that friendship for me is deeply felt, and it's from the heart, and I will always stand up for Israel and for the Jewish community, regardless of whether it's popular to do it or not, regardless of whether it's fashionable to do it or not, because I believe it's the right thing to do, and that the community can always rely upon me to stand up strongly and raise my voice when things are going on that means that Israel or the community is attracting more than its fair share of criticism.
Well, thank you for that, and people can judge you from your record.
Absolutely.
And the recent statements that you've made on issues like the Sydney Festival BDS and Amnesty International speak for themselves, and they have been louder and clearer than the other side of politics. So thank you so much.
Thanks for your time, David. Appreciate talking to you.